Alrighty, and welcome. This will be the first in a series. This is a one of three, and this series is going to be about triaging internal authentication and brute forcing relative to the security operations center on the cyber side, as opposed to the physical side. So, a few things I wanted to cover before we get started is generally speaking, we're going to cover the lab environment. We're going to cover some really key login codes or event IDs. And then lastly, we will cover some very common authentication mechanisms that we're going to see in the lab, as well as in our practical, we will also see these authentication mechanisms. Now, this is not the end all be all to triaging login events or any kinds of authentication methods being used, but I'll go ahead and put a set of brief notes on Notepad on the screen. And this is going to be the gist of what we're going to be covering out before we get into the lab here. So we're gonna take a look at these event codes. If you want to write them down, fine. This is not something that you need to commit to memory now. Just kind of know that they exist. And I feel like by the end of the practical, we're gonna have a better idea of what's going on with these. We'll start with that eventually. First, we're gonna go ahead and go over the lab, and I'm gonna put these resources in the description just so that you can read further on what these authentication mechanisms are. Because for things like Kerberos and NTLM, they are basically the backbone of authentication in any Windows-based environment. So they're very important to know. It's not just relative to brute force alerts or anything like that. Knowledge of Kerberos and NTLM will serve you well past entry-level SOC alerts. So let's get right into the lab, or I guess how the lab is set up. In the next couple videos, we'll do more practical stuff, but it ran too long. So let's do this. So this is the lab. We have a domain that I created. This is lockoutlab.local. And within this lab, there are two devices. So there's a domain controller and a normal workstation. The workstation names are listed above the devices themselves. And then outside of the bubble, so the bubble represents the domain, and the devices that are not domain joined are a device that I have quote unquote rogue box and the Kali box that I'll be using just to do just do some additional testing of what the same authentications we do here. Because what I'll do is we'll have some authentication that looks like this. And then we also may have some authentication that looks like this, and we'll kind of see how it all looks based on what we know. And these should all be able to talk to each other because they're on the same subnet. This is all /24. So I've already tested it. They can talk to each other, so we're all looking good there. All right. Now let's go ahead and let's do a very brief section on how exactly we look into these codes. Because even when you're on the job, so if you're studying for Sec Plus, if you're trying to get an interview, if you're trying to um, really do well in an interview, I feel like starting here is a pretty good idea. Because outside of like the general Security Plus questions you may get in an interview, I feel like if you can talk to some of the stuff that you're explaining or that you're answering interview questions with is a pretty strong start, and it makes you different from everyone else who's interviewing as well. So, to start off, Windows authentication is one of the most basic and also some of the more complex and important parts of any investigation that you'll do, even if we're just talking about a brute force, because brute forces and internal authentication can quickly lead to something out of hand. So, let's talk a little bit about the 4624 and 4625. So, like, what are these? So, these are Windows event IDs that are populated within Active Directory every time you log in. And this can be on a local device that these are prompting on. This can be on a domain controller. And we will look at that after. So what we'll do is, so first thing you should do if you don't know something, let's Google it. I don't know what a 4624 is. What is 4624 Windows? Cool. We'll go ahead and take the Microsoft Learn documentation. So it's got a few fields built out for us, right? And we're just going to start with 4624 and its counterpart 4625, which is a failed login. And these are generally the same. Like anything that you see in a 4625, you generally will see in a 4624. So the important fields to look at, we've got some network stuff going on down here. We've got some we've got some account stuff happening here. And we've got some authentication stuff. So how was the session established, or how was the session authenticated? So let's go from top down. So both in 4625 and 4624s, we see the user, we see the domain here. So the domain in this case is the local device because it's a local login. I'll go more into that in the practical, and I'll also give a little bit of a snippet here. We have a logon ID, which is unique to the session of the 4624. We'll also get into that later. And then we have a lot of the useful stuff. So this is all very useful, right? I will say that for me, knowing the source of the authentication is very important. So if you're ever triaging um, a brute force, or maybe it's something that's not a brute force, maybe it's a password spray, or maybe it's just credentials that are stuck on a normal endpoint. Can't tell without context, but the source of the authentication will help you move one step further in your investigation. And then lastly, we have the authentication information, which is how did this happen? Why? So earlier I spoke about Kerberos, I spoke about um, NTLM, ADV API, user 32. So let me bring that back up. I spoke about these, and where it says detailed authentication information, you will find normally you find Kerberos, NTLM, ADV API, user 32. There's a couple others that I'll cover in an external authentication type video. But as it stands now, this is what we're looking at. So if you mix authentication with like how did it authenticate with the type of logon that happened here, you will find some very interesting things. And it's so interesting that Microsoft has an entire section dedicated to logon types. So let's go ahead and look at that. Erase this. Let's move this. Logon types. So these are very, very important. They tell the story very differently depending on what type of logon type you have. So 4624, let's go over a few examples. So interactive is usually this user is physically at the computer. This one is this user logged in to this device over the network. So maybe you're not sitting right in front of it. Maybe you hit the VPN and then you log into a computer. You have your typical unlock. So if your computer was, if you just did Windows L and then you log back in, it'll pop an unlock. And then interactive, RDP, really good for lateral movement and just controlling devices themselves. And those are the four that I'll touch on now. Those are the four most common. I would say three is quite common, or just say the most common. And these aren't the only authentication logs that are important. Moving on from these, you have, so these are the ones we talked about, 46, 24, and 25, which is successful and failed. These are also Kerberos base slash NTLM login codes that you will be looking at when you're trying to triage brute force alerts or just any type of login events you have at the SOC. So when I said earlier that you need to know what Kerberos and NTLM is, because it just never stops. It won't go away anytime soon, I'm pretty sure. So it's worth learning it now if you can. I'll include these links in the comment, or not in the comments, but in the description, just so you can take a peek and read a little more if you'd like. But with that being said, I just wanted this to be an introduction of why this information is important, what it is, and what we can expect going into the lab, because we will be seeing most, if not all, of these event codes pop up, and we will take a really strong look at the information that Microsoft themselves have listed on their website. So, with that being said, I'll go ahead and shoot you over to part two, which will be us using a VM, logging in, and then looking at those events that populate and how those are impactful to us. And then in the third video, I'll do more of a example where I do a brute force from my Kali box, and then how does that look on our domain? What happens? What do we see in our usernames? What do we see, in our logs? And that'll be more of a practical as opposed to just doing something and looking for the results. So I'll go ahead and kick you over to the next video, and we'll catch you there.